So, I have a confession to make. Well, two confessions, actually. Confession number one. I am an enormous fan of Nickelodeon's Avatar: The Last Airbender. To me, and to many others, this series stands as the absolute pinnacle of animated storytelling for children or adults. It was a show that was years ahead of its time, and even outperforms many animated shows today in terms of quality. It pushed every single boundary you could imagine a children's show could push, and even 20 years after its release, it remains the gold standard against which all modern animated TV series are compared. Aside from it being a beloved series and nostalgic favorite in the eyes of millions of young adults today, it is also my personal favorite animated series of all time, and even ranks higher in my mind than most live-action adult-oriented dramas. Which leads me to my second confession. I have not seen, nor will I likely ever see, Netflix's live-action remake of Avatar: The Last Airbender. There are many fans of the original Avatar who have watched the Netflix remake and enjoyed it, and there are just as many fans who watched it and didn't. Reception to the series has been a pretty mixed bag so far, and a lot of criticism has been aimed toward the dialogue, the writing, the acting, and various changes made to the original narrative and the characters that just don't sit right with many fans of the original show. This video isn't going to be a qualitative assessment of the remake itself because, obviously, since I haven't seen it, I can't really give a review of it that would be fair. Although, from what I have seen in terms of the writing and the acting, I'm definitely less than impressed, and that's already a huge indictment against the series. My philosophy of remaking any work of media is that the remake should either be a completely new take on the source material, or, if you're adapting it, then it should at least manage to be as good as the original, if not better. Which is why I was never a fan of making a live-action adaptation of Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's one of the reasons I'm usually pretty bored by remakes in general, because Hollywood has this unfortunate tendency to focus on adapting works that were already really good, without drastically reimagining the material to make it into something unique, meaning there's not much room to climb higher and a lot of room to fall short. So when Netflix announced in 2019 that they would be adapting one of the greatest animated series of all time, my immediate reaction was just nothing. I wasn't excited by the trailers, and I wasn't even that disappointed when interviews kept pouring out in the weeks leading up to the show's release that revealed the changes they were making that people got upset about. Because at the end of the day, I knew I wasn't invested no matter what they did. The absolute best case scenario for me was that they would just copy the original, but then what's the point? If your goal is to just copy and paste the whole series into a live-action format, then you're only setting yourself up for failure, because you're only really giving us a slight variation on what we've already seen before, but worse. Like a photo that's been run through a copy machine 100 times and comes out looking faded and garbled. Now, on a more positive note, it does look like a far superior adaptation than what we got with the M. Night Shyamalan disaster back in 2010. It puts a lot more effort into looking, sounding, and feeling like the original series. But here's the thing. If the original Avatar was like a 5-course meal at a Michelin star restaurant, and the 2010 adaptation was like an old, moldy sandwich that got left in the fridge for 3 months, then the Netflix adaptation is like a breakfast platter at Denny's. And that's the inherent problem with this whole project. I personally don't see much value in watching an adaptation of something I love that I know comes up so far short of the original. But this whole endeavor leads me into the main subject of the video that I want to talk about. In my last video, I talked about how animation wasn't taken seriously in Western cultures for a long time until recently. I talked about how animated sitcoms and cartoons in the 90s worked to reform people's ideas about animation as a medium geared exclusively towards children, and although I neglected to talk as much about them, more serious, dramatic, and action-oriented works of animation also contributed to that change, like Avatar: The Last Airbender. But one aspect of this trend that I didn't mention was the relationship between popular animated media and live-action adaptations. For decades now, Hollywood studios have made numerous attempts at translating animated shows and movies into live action, with pretty checkered results. Every once in a while, you'll get an unexpected diamond in the rough, like One Piece or Scott Pilgrim vs. the World or Detective Pikachu, but more often than not, you'll get something more along the lines of a Death Note, Flintstones, or Speed Racer, or any of the myriad Disney live-action remakes, or if you're really unlucky, you'll get something like Dragon Ball Evolution, or, well, The Last Airbender. Live-action adaptations are notoriously difficult to pull off correctly. There's a number of reasons for this, but ultimately the problem boils down to a lack of awareness of how to properly account for the limitations of live-action when trying to copy the look and feel of an animated property. Actors can't move or emote the way cartoon characters can. Live sets and props can't evoke the same kind of brightly colored and stylized appearance as animated ones, and even when adapting works like anime or Disney films that utilize a higher degree of realism and detail in their drawings and motion, the live-action version can usually look pretty unappealing by comparison due to, well, real life not looking as good as animation can. Animation can be bright and colorful, it can change and be expressed in unique and infinite different ways, and you don't have to obey a lot of those pesky laws of physics that get in the way of being able to do crazy, insane action sequences, or musical numbers, or trippy, cartoonish slapstick comedy. Resourceful and talented directors can find ways around these limitations, but the point remains true that animation provides a broader toolbox for expressing a storyteller's imagination than live action has. Clever camera work and lighting and practical effects can get you a long way, but nothing compares to the literally infinite potential of animation, which is why it's so strange that we seem to place such a premium on live-action adaptations of animated media. Part of the reason for this could go back to the problem of Western animation largely being targeted towards children up until the last couple decades. If you're a kid and there's a show you really like, chances are pretty high that the show is animated, higher than if you were an adult at least. And if you have an animated show that you like, but maybe only you and your friends or other people in your age group watch, it can feel kind of validating to see big studios in Hollywood recognize that show or movie you love and adapt it for broader audiences. And even though I think adults are by and large more willing to accept animation as a serious medium nowadays, it's clear with releases like Avatar: The Last Airbender that the feeling of validation people get from such an adaptation is still alive and well even in the modern era. And I'll admit, I'm speaking from a bit of experience. When the original 2010 remake of Avatar came out, I was stoked for mainstream audiences to see a show I loved and thought only people in my age group watched. I mean, it came on next to SpongeBob and Fairly Odd Parents, for God's sake. There weren't many adults watching Avatar back then. And no matter which generation you grew up in, chances are some cartoon or anime or other work of animation you watched as a kid has at some point been adapted by major studios into live action. But I think we're starting to reach a turning point where we're beginning to realize just how backwards that validating process actually is. The more projects I see that have either already gotten or are slated to get the live-action treatment from Netflix or other major studios, the more I get the sense that people are just sort of getting tired of it. As animation becomes more widely accepted and more adult-oriented, there's less of a need for live-action adaptations to act as the legitimizing force to get mainstream audiences interested in niche properties. And without that legitimizing factor, I think people are starting to realize just how little sense it makes to make translations from animation, which is effectively limitless, to live action. which is much more limited. In fact, it feels like the culture might be starting to shift more in the opposite direction now. There seems to be a slowly growing appetite for animated adaptations of live-action properties, which, to be clear, is also nothing new, but the dynamics have become different in keeping with the change of perception towards animation in general. After all, back in the 80s and 90s, you had tons of live-action movies like Ghostbusters, Batman, Men in Black, Beetlejuice, and RoboCop that got animated adaptations made for television, but these were all marketed toward kids. Nowadays, however, there appears to be more of a hunger for seeing live-action films and shows made for adults reimagined in animated form, also for adults. Even landmark HBO dramas like Game of Thrones and blockbuster action franchises like John Wick have produced murmurs of animated adaptations in the future. Of course, that's not to say this has become a common trend in the industry yet, because the industry is clearly still geared primarily toward live-action adaptations of animated media. Regardless of what happens with those projects, and regardless of whether we see a future shift toward animated adaptations more in the near future, I think overall the main takeaway from projects like Netflix's Avatar remake is that people are generally just exhausted by live-action remakes, because so few of them have a good reason to exist and lack the capacity to measure up to their source material. One of the things that made One Piece such a remarkable exception to this rule is not only that it was executed well, but also because that show has a really good reason to exist. If you're a fan of the original One Piece, you're probably going to have a hard time convincing many mainstream viewers to commit to a series with over 1,000 episodes and featuring bizarre cartoonish visuals and characters. Paring down that extra fluff and filler and mitigating the craziness of the anime's style just enough to where it remains familiar but more grounded works to make the story accessible to most audiences who wouldn't otherwise have the time or patience to sit through that long of a show. But even with other anime adaptations which have a similar excuse to exist, after all, many popular anime have exceptionally long runs. Too often, the challenge of trying to get past all those pesky restrictions inherent to using live sets and actors and environments to recreate animated worlds and characters and movement proves too difficult for most directors to negotiate. So hopefully, even if we don't start seeing a radical new shift toward animating live-action properties, we can maybe stop fixating on turning every popular work of animation into live action. Because at the end of the day, it seems like the main reason this continues to happen is out of a misguided idea that live action will grant these stories some form of prestige or respect that they wouldn't otherwise receive from mainstream audiences. While I think there was definitely a time where the public's imagination was more closed to the idea of animation, especially children's animation, being a valid and serious artistic medium, I think those times are starting to recede in the rearview mirror. We live in a time now where most adults under the age of 40 have grown up being challenged in some way by the animated media they consume, both as children and as adults. The stigma around the medium is fading, and with that stigma should also go all the old insecurities about how broadly animation can be appreciated by mainstream audiences on its own merits. While I don't think live action is at all a bad medium for storytelling, I think it's objectively true that animation has by far the greater range of potential, which makes it the superior mode of artistic expression. That's why I have no interest in seeing the Netflix adaptation of Avatar: The Last Airbender, because I already know that the original series perfectly captured everything that story had to convey. It was the ultimate realization of what that story could be. I can already tell that the visuals of the remake don't match up for me, nor does the action or the comedy. Is it better than the 2010 version? Of course, but it's not enough. The original series doesn't need validation by being watered down into a medium that can only ever do less than its animated counterpart, and I don't see the value in pretending like it's worth my time to watch when I know I'm just going to be spoon-fed an inferior version of a show I've already watched countless times. Maybe if the show tried to be more different, or maybe if it had the guts to just tell a brand new story, like just make a straight prequel about Avatar Kyoshi. They clearly like using that character enough in the remake, then I'd give it a look. But if the Disney live-action remakes have taught me anything, it's that just because an adaptation might do some things differently, it doesn't make me obliged to watch it just for those few things that might be different and might not even be good anyway. I know, it's not exactly fair. Don't judge a book by its cover, yada yada, yeah, I get all that. But I'm just not convinced by that anymore. I've been through this rodeo too many times over the years to pretend like the vast majority of these remakes aren't just copycats pretending to be something different and fresh when really all they ever do is regurgitate beloved stories in a way that doesn't arouse a fraction of the emotional investment of their source material. I'm always willing to be proven wrong, and I have seen live-action adaptations over the last few years that I do consider worthwhile and enjoyable in their own right. But these are still the exceptions to the rule. Animators have worked their asses off for decades now, trying to reform people's perception of the medium and make it clear to audiences that animated shows, even ones nominally aimed at children, deserve serious attention and respect. And I think it's kind of a disservice to the people who've worked to make that change to just keep pretending that live action can somehow do something better than animation can. I'm tired of playing that game. I'm not saying there shouldn't ever be any more live action remakes of animated media. I'm just saying maybe we don't need to keep pretending like it's some big deal whenever one of these adaptations gets announced. There's nothing special about live action that should give these stories validation. They're already valid, and they always have been. So if you're one of the people that watched the new Netflix series and liked it and is looking forward to more, God bless, more power to you. Glad you had a good time with it. Reimagining something is fine, so long as you have a real reason to reimagine it. And if someone in the future wants to take another crack at this series in a way that really is fresh and new and tries to tell a different story, then I'll be here for it. But until then, I'm perfectly happy with the masterpiece we already have.